I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I want to welcome everyone this evening to an exciting conversation and an exciting installment for our next Great Wednesday webinar series. And as you can see, the screen is a little bit different this evening. We have our own Ryan Hawthorne facilitating the conversation and having the conversation tonight with our guest. And so we're certainly in for a treat. My name is Roger Hutchison. I'm the Director of Christian Formation and Parish Life at Palmer. And again, I want to welcome you here. I especially want to welcome our guest, President Julia Ayala Harris. And I'm going to share a little bit about President Harris, and I'm just excited. Again, thank you for being with us this evening. At the 80th General Convention in 2022, Julia Ayala Harris was elected President of the House of Deputies, the presiding officer who works alongside the presiding bishop. President Harris is the first Latina and woman of color to hold the position. She is passionate about a multitude of issues, such as immigration, race and ethnicity, LGBTQ plus inclusion, and truth-telling, as well as justice initiatives. As a lay leader, President Ayala Harris serves the church in multiple roles, including leadership roles on the Executive Council, the presiding officer's working group on truth-telling, reckoning, and healing, and the Task Force for Women, Truth, and Reconciliation, among various other legislative committees and interim bodies. In the Episcopal Church, President Harris has continually found healing, blessing, and wholeness in God's unconditional love. Throughout her lay ministry, she has worked to bring about a church that can share the blessing with all of God's people. And we are thrilled and honored that she's joining us tonight from Norman, Oklahoma. And so welcome. And we're thrilled you're here. And I'm going to turn it over now to Ryan. Before I do that, I want to remind folks that you can put your questions in the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A box, and I will take care of those for you. And the way it'll flow is Ryan will have a conversation. They will do this for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will wrap up with about 20 minutes of questions or so. Thank you, everybody. And I am going to turn it over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Roger. Welcome, President Harris, to Palmer Church. We just have a few questions for you, and we're just excited to have this conversation. So can you tell us how long or how you came to be in the Episcopal Church to begin with? Are you a cradle Episcopalian? Did you join like lots of us? Did you find it as a young adult or an adult? How did you come to be in the Episcopal Church?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to thank you all for inviting me to be here. It's so good to meet people from across the church and get to hear their stories and hear more about your church and your strategic plan that you all are working on. And it helps. I love learning, so it helps me learn more and more about our church. So thank you for this invitation. I came to the Episcopal Church in college. I was about 20, I guess, and I was raised Catholic in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And then I had a spiritual awakening as a teenager and was really searching for God. And I had always had this sort of deep internal spirituality inside myself. And when I had the spiritual awakening and went back to my Catholic church, there really wasn't anything for a teenager that was feeling more excited about church. There wasn't youth group, and there was no place for me to plug into. And I had friends that went to an evangelical youth group. And so they invited me over there, and I, for a few years, went to an evangelical church and then an evangelical college. So I guess I would have identified as evangelical. And during college, I was exploring a little bit more when it came to different denominations. And I actually, ironically enough, really wanted a church that had some of the structure of the Catholic Church, but not some of that same kind of structure. But I also wanted a church that allowed its people to have the voice of that you would find in a congregational church. And interestingly enough, I had a professor and a classmate who would openly identify as Episcopalian, and they had these really neat ideas, and they talked about their church in such a loving way. And one afternoon, or on a Sunday, it was the very last service of the day. It's hilarious that, because of course I didn't wake up early to try out a new church. So I go to the very last service of the day on a Sunday as a 20-year-old at an Episcopal church. And there was a woman priest who was presiding and handing out communion wafers. And my mind was blown, because I didn't realize that women could be priests. I didn't realize that women could have roles of authority and be seen in that way in leadership in a church. And I was pretty much sold right then. And then I just jumped into, membership classes and confirmation classes, and I moved across the country to do various volunteer things, but kept trying out Episcopal churches until finally I was able to become a member and became a youth group leader. So that way an Episcopal church could have a youth group and kids could have a place to go after they had spiritual encounters and all that kind of stuff. So it was a little bit of a winding road, but not too winding. And it's interesting because now I tell the story sometimes, and I have yet to reach back and engage with the woman priest that was there that Sunday, but I'm told that it's a small church. So I'm told that she knows that it's her. And so at some point we'll get together and it'll be a good reunion, I think.
That's really cool. I feel like that's such a Episcopal, like a common story in the Episcopal church. Like someone's looking for something that has structure, but also the depth of spirituality, and they like somehow stumble into the Episcopal church. Like no one is like, I'm going to the Episcopal church. Everyone's just kind of like, my friend told me, or my professor, or, I was walking by and I happened to see this church and I went in. But like, so we tend to draw people who are searching, or we're a denomination of searchers, which I think is really cool, because then people naturally bring their curiosity to our church. What have you, since you started in the Episcopal Church, what has changed the most in your view over time?
Oh, that's really good. I would have to say, this is going to sound a little ironic now being president of the House of Deputies, but I would have to say in a lot of ways, the leadership that we uphold in the church has changed the most. So I came into the Episcopal Church around the time of Gene Robinson's consecration. And so that was highly formative to me at the time. And the conversations that I was a part of in various parishes, because I had moved again as a young adult, inspired me to stay in the church, because we were willing to have these conversations openly with each other. And then with the election of Catherine Jefferson Shorey and Michael Curry, we've been seeing these historic elections, and the way that our church has responded to the leadership that we have. Let me back up, because there's something about embodied representation, that it's one thing that our church has long had policies or statements about women in leadership, and policies and statements about trying to say that we are, of course, against racism, and that we want to include everyone in every level of our church, regardless of their background or their race or their ethnicity or their gender or their sexual orientation. And it has been a whole nother thing to elect leadership that represents that through their actual identity. And so the way that we have, as a church, responded to the priorities that those leaders have given us and challenged us with, I think has been one of the joys of being Episcopalian over these years. And so that, I think, is how we've changed the most, perhaps, in addition to, some other things, like now we do Zooms like this one on Wednesdays, but that's,
Yeah,
we could talk about that separately.
we are now a tech savvy church, but I really like I really liked what you had to say about embodied representation, because yeah, historically the church has been willing to make statements. So I'm thinking about like the statements that bishops put out right after Brown v. Board saying, you know what we should do? We should prepare our congregations for this this big change, or like the statements that bishops put out in the like 70s and 80s about women's ministry, and then again about in response to the AIDS epidemic, but not like having structural changes so that it reflected in the leadership of the church. So it's good. It's so nice to have people who can mark that change in their own, like with their own eyes. As someone, I came into the Episcopal Church in 2014. And so all of these changes, like Gene Robinson had already happened. Catherine Jefferds Shorey was already the presiding bishop. And Michael Curry was about to be elected the presiding bishop. So I walked into a church and I was like, oh my gosh, they're so great. And not having seen like all of the changes and like the ways in which people were struggling for change and working for change. So that's really cool.
You now, but we'll save that for another time because I want to know what it was like coming in 2014.
Yeah. Oh, it was very exciting. I was like, oh my God, this is the like best place ever. I will say in 2015 when presiding Bishop Curry was elected presiding bishop, I was like following from afar because I was here in Houston, and my friend and I were driving down Westheimer, which is a long street in Houston, and we happened to be like by a bank. We were by Bank of America. And she was driving and I was just kind of scrolling on my phone, and it said Michael Curry elected presiding bishop, and we like swung into the parking lot of this Bank of America, and we parked and we both got out and started running around. Mind you, we're in the space where the drive-through for the tellers, for the ATMs. So people are just like, what is happening? Why are these two women just running around this car? And we were just screaming and yelling because it was just such an exciting time. And I think I'll probably never forget that day.
Yeah.
So I was doing some research in preparation for this. Oh, wait, I lost you. What did you say?
Oh, I said I had a similar response too with Catherine Jefferds Shorey, but go ahead. It's fun.
Oh yeah, I want to hear about that. I was reading about you, just kind of preparing for this interview, and I saw that from 2012 to 2015, you served on the task force to reimagine the Episcopal Church. And so I'd never heard of this task force. So I'm very curious to know what the extent and scope of the work of that task force was or is. And then like what structures or changes were reimagined through that committee?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The task force to reimagine the Episcopal Church went by TREC as our acronym. And I served on it along with presiding Bishop Michael Curry and a few others. It ended up being quite the leadership development group for many of us. Several people have gone on to be bishops. For me, part of the mandate of that group was this wide-ranging scope of a mandate, which was just to reimagine the church's administration, structure, and governance functions. And it called for people who had institutional distance or distance from institutional leadership. So when they put out for the first time, it was like a SurveyMonkey type of, it was the first time that the church had put out something kind of like that, like a clarion call to everyone in the church. And, also following general conventions and Episcopal News Service all the time. And just from afar, like you said, with your experience in 2015, I saw that this committee was being formed and that they had put out an application where anyone could apply. And at that point, I had just returned not too long before from international ministry in South Sudan and Kenya. And I was running a nonprofit. I was an executive director. I had this experience doing youth ministry in the Episcopal Church. I adore our church, and I put in an application. And something in that application prompted then President Jennings to appoint me. So I was the person with the most critical distance from institutional leadership on the committee, which is now completely wild to think about that 10 years later, I'm president of the House of Deputies. Because at that point, I wasn't even on my local parish's vestry. I was doing different ministries, just like a volunteer in the diocese and at my local parish, but I definitely did not have institutional leadership at the time. And so we had this unbelievable mandate and task, and we were one of the first task forces. Back then we had committees, commissions, agencies and boards called CCABs, and those were more established. So we had 3 years to reimagine the Episcopal Church. And we had various subcommittees that different folks worked on. We came up with a report, and the presiding bishop likes to say, and he's talking more about Trek again lately, that it was the report that was the fastest to be blackballed the moment it hit the blue books and General Convention in 2015. So it's so funny to bring it back up now, so many years later. But we conducted a survey asking people what it was that they loved the most about the church, what their stories were with the church. So we had a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. And then we asked the church a series of questions about itself, the way that we organize dioceses, the notion of like one bishop, one diocese, and then trickling down to parishes, the function of having one rector to one parish. And what we were really looking at was the decline of Christian faith and practice in America. And what does that mean for our future? And so we had a lot of conversations about, well, we need to be a more networked church. We need to focus more on networking than hierarchy. We will likely need to look at merging dioceses in the future. And what does that look like? We will likely need to look at what does it mean if we have one bishop that oversees more than one diocese. And so we had a lot of those types of things in the report, along with some structural changes to General Convention and the ways that we go about doing church. A lot of that was not well accepted, but it did prompt people to, in their, I don't like this resolution, it prompted them to defend what they do love about our structures. But the other piece, looking back on it almost immediately, that I realized was that we were looking at cultural change, and we were coming up with and mandated to give structural answers to cultural change. And perhaps our report and our approach would have been very different if we came at it from well, what are things we have to change about our culture rather than structural? But, hindsight's 2020. Ultimately, we ended up bonding quite well. We built these really great relationships. That's where I first got to know the presiding bishop, and prompted me to run for executive council, where I have been serving in various capacities over the last 7 years.
I think that's really amazing. I don't know if you can hear the stomping. We're having okay, good. There's a ballet class above my office right now, and all I hear is like stomping as we're having a big event at Palmer on Saturday, and they are preparing to perform. I think that's so interesting that the question of structure led to this wider conversation about decline of Christian faith and practice in America, and what that looks like for the Episcopal Church, particularly because we can be like a top heavy church a lot of the times. Like, we're not as necessarily as like agile as like a congregationalist kind of church where you just have one pastor, one congregation. They're not tied to anything else. So if they want to close, they close. If they want to move, they move. And so the idea that people would have that we have to negotiate, do we have rectors that serve multiple churches or shared rectors? And do we have to will we share bishops, is such a huge question that for folks in the Diocese of Texas, we probably don't consider enough, because our diocese is so big and so doing pretty well. So I think we can often ignore that. But I'm thinking about the diocese of like Maine and Vermont
Mhm.
and New Hampshire who recently did this, right? Who recently said, we're going to share bishops so that we can find some sustainability and so that our bishops aren't getting overwhelmed with the amount of visitations and sharing resources. And I think also, is it the diocese of in Wisconsin? Was it Wisconsin that just
Oh,
did
yes.
this?
Do that too. And Western New York and is it West at Sean Rowe? He's in one of the Pennsylvanias in Western New York.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And Bishop Andy Doyle was on Trek as well with us. And I can't help but look at the reunion of formerly Diocese of Fort Worth and then Diocese of North Texas with Texas as being another, maybe Trek laid the groundwork for that. People might disagree with that, but I can't help but think maybe it did.
Yeah, it definitely was a joyous occasion to be able to welcome them back into the Diocese of Texas, reunify with them. And it seemed like they were very happy to do so. Like I've talked to several, that's the diocese I started in the Episcopal Church. I'm from Fort Worth, and so I know several lay people and several clergy there, and talking with them, they didn't seem to think that they were losing like autonomy or losing their bishop. They were happy to be gaining this whole like new camaraderie of folks to be in community with. So that was really, I'm with you. I'm willing to say like Trek laid the groundwork for that, because definitely getting it on people's minds that there might need to be shared resources, like people resources. Did Trek help? I want to shift a little bit into your work as the president of the House of Deputies. And so I'm going to hold the question about this follow-up question about Trek and your hopes and your term. But just to get us all on the same page, can you tell us about the House of Deputies in the Episcopal Church and specifically about the role of the president of the House of Deputies?
Oh, yeah. So normally every 3 years, it changed this time because of the pandemic. The Episcopal Church holds its General Convention, which is the highest legislative body of the church, and it makes all of the policy for the Episcopal Church and holds elections. So it's like a diocesan convention at the churchwide level. So that's where all of the dioceses send their bishops, but they also send equal numbers of lay and clergy. And so there's 4 lay deputies and 4 clergy deputies for every diocese, and then a smattering of alternates depending on the diocese. And so the House of Deputies consists of these 4 lay and 4 clergy, along with the alternate deputies. And together it's over 800 deputies. So it's this big, massive hall of over 800 folks from across the church, and we're in multiple countries, right? So we're in about 16 countries, and you'll see deputies from the Diocese of Columbia and the deputies from the Diocese of Taiwan, sharing space alongside, Diocese of Chicago, for example. And then the House of Deputies meets at the same time and in tandem with the House of Bishops. So General Convention is bicameral. We have the House of Deputies meeting at the same time as the House of Bishops, and a few times we will get together and have a joint session to solicit common discernment, always on the budget. And then at this next General Convention, we will also have time together to talk about or to meet the PB nominees that we'll have at that point, the slate of nominees that the bishops will vote their next presiding bishop on or from. So like the presiding bishop presides over the House of Bishops, the president of the House of Deputies presides over the House of Deputies. So I have yet to take the gavel and preside over 800 deputies. I'm beginning to have dreams about that I'm sure will turn into nightmares later on. But it's very similar in some ways to the way that our US government is structured. In the House of the House of Representatives is, could be kind of somewhat synonymous with the House of Deputies, although they have a different number of people per state. And we have equal a balance between deputies and clergy, or clergy and lay in the House of Deputies. But I would essentially then, in that role, with a gavel, kind of come off to someone. If they were to walk in, they would think, oh, this is like a Nancy Pelosi type of person, or a Speaker of the House or whatever. Because it's that big and kind of raucous, and everyone, has a good time, and they decorate their tables and all this kind of stuff. It has its own history. And then when we're not having general convention, as president of the House of Deputies, I am the vice chair of executive council while the presiding bishop is chair. And I'm vice president of our incorporated nonprofit entity, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. So the presiding bishop and I work a lot together in tandem. He as chair and president, me as vice chair and vice president. And then when we come together at general convention, we preside over our two houses.
For that. I didn't realize that the president of the House of Deputies is the vice president of the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society. Can you speak about that society and its historical significance in the life of our church, just really quickly? I mean,
I'm a little bit like, where to begin? So the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society has an acronym, DFMS, that I'll try not to use, but because it's so long. That is our incorporated nonprofit entity in the state of New York, and is essentially where all of our staff work, the churchwide staff work there and work for them. And it is the churchwide organization for the Episcopal Church. So it's interesting because the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society is, the employer and the nonprofit and that sort of thing. And it has its own board of directors. But all of that is the same as what we would consider the Episcopal Church, along with executive council is the same as the board of directors. They're the same entity for both. And so then in that sense, executive council makes decisions between general conventions on behalf of the church, but also is a board of directors for the nonprofit entity. And so I get to, it's the thing that is the real big sticking point for everyone is that, or for everyone who's been in this role, so myself and President Jennings, is that means that we give our opening remarks right after the presiding bishop gives his opening remarks. And so we always follow presiding Bishop Michael Curry, and it is just not a fun place to be.
No, I feel like they should switch. Well, we don't know who's going to be the next presiding bishop. Maybe the next presiding bishop, everyone will be like, thank God Julia is speaking now. We can only.
I do decide that, I'm not, I'll just go in with my own chill type of vibe or whatever. There's no competing, right? So
yeah, I'd never want to have to speak after him because he's just so lively. For all of you watching, the first mission of the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society way back in the 1700s, or I guess way back in the 1800s when it was like really getting started, was Texas. They sent someone to plant a church in Texas or to like see what was happening out here in the West. And so Texas is the first mission field of the Episcopal Church. That's just for y'all to know about ourselves. Julia, can you tell us, I know from your interview, I watched your interview like right after you became president-elect, like they had just announced it, and Albert was interviewing you on the floor of General Convention, and he was asking you like, what are you wanting to do? What do you want to focus on? And I know that one of your stated goals was, to make our governance structures more inclusive and accessible to communities that have often experienced those same structures to be less accessible or open to their involvement. But I'm wondering, like, what other goals have you set for your program or scope of work during your first term as president of the deputies?
Oh gosh, and right after my election was such a surprise to me that I don't know what I wouldn't be horrified to go back and watch any of those interviews. because I was stunned. I think I still am stunned. But you hit on, I have what I discerned after the election to be my 3 priority themes that will act as value lenses for the work that I do as president. And I wanted to be really clear that the presiding bishop in his discernment discerned the Jesus movement to be considered with 3 pillars: evangelism, creation care, and racial reconciliation. And my 3 priority themes are not in conflict with that at all. And it's a very sort of, again, they're value lenses. They're not meant to replace anything. And you hit on 2 of them. They were accessibility in our governance structures, so more people could be engaged and informed, inclusivity in that everyone feels that they have a place at the table. And then the 3rd one is safety. And that really, to me, comes out of the first 2, because if we begin to make our churches more accessible to people and we begin to include more people, that also means that we have to keep those people safe. Because in many ways, those people come from traditionally marginalized communities or are vulnerable in other ways. And so safety seemed to be a natural 3rd priority for me. And also, when I was elected, I had been the chair of the Legislative Committee on Sexual Harassment, Sexual Exploitation, and Safeguarding. And so, again, it's kind of natural to who I am, and one of the leadership lenses that I brought to all of this work when it comes to creating safe communities for Christians to be in. So a lot of the work that I've been doing so far actually does have to do with the safety lens for the past 9 months or so. But then it's so overlaps with inclusivity and accessibility. It's a really interesting kind of a thing to try to differentiate them sometimes.
I really like these 3 pillars. How do you, when you talk about your work over the last 9 months, I'm assuming that some of that work is with the executive council. So like, what does your day-to-day work look like, working life look like, and how do you, I know you have an agenda, how do you implement it?
Yeah. So one, I like spreadsheets a lot. And so I have a spreadsheet with these 3 pillars, and then I have such a nerd. And then I actually have them separated out in 2 different functions. And this goes with something I said earlier, actually. So it's kind of natural. And they are structural changes and cultural changes. So for example, on executive council, we have we had to revisit our HR manual, and we've done so, and we've included new policies. So we've updated policies on children and vulnerable adults, but also we included a policy, a very new policy that's called declared names policy. And so within that is about, for example, trans people or non-binary folks who perhaps went by one name before, and this applies to the workplace, right, to DFMS, and go by a new name now, and how we will approach the declared names. But also it comes down to things like, oh, now I'm suddenly, our translation interpretation services. So being able to have enough money in our budgets to be able to offer simultaneous translation at all of our official meetings. And also, did I say simultaneous interpretation? I'm so sorry. And we talked about translation some today, actually, so my brain's a little, and then also, for example, today we had a large budget conversation because we'll be looking at Name's budget, and we have to prioritize what we translate. So what on the website and with what specific Spanish dialect do we want to use when we translate different parts of our website or pamphlets that we make or any of that. And we have 3 languages we need to have things translated into: English, obviously English, and then Spanish and French, but we also do a lot of Haitian Creole and Taiwanese, and potentially a lot more than that in the future. But again, it's about, how do we express this to the church that it's important? How do we put it in the moral document that is our budget and bring value to it, so that way we can bring more people in, making it more accessible and inclusive?
Thanks for that. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that really helps to, I think for a long time, I didn't know exactly what, Gail, is it Gay Jennings
Oh,
did.
yeah.
Like, I was like, I know that she presides over the House of Deputies during General Convention, and I know that she does a lot of work, but I didn't know exactly like the day-to-day.
I could talk more about the day-to-day, but it kind of varies by day.
So that means you work pretty closely with the presiding bishop on a regular basis. And then the executive council is the executive council. It's elected people from all over the church, like, and is it lay and clergy?
So executive council is a 40-member body. They are elected through two venues, through the provinces. So one, we have a few spots. I think it's 18 spots come from the provinces. And then the other 20 come from general conventions. So lay and ordained folks are elected at the House of Deputies, and bishops are elected at the House of Bishops. And then the other two are the two presiding officers. So that makes up the 40. And the other pieces that come into play on a day-to-day basis have to do with, we have a lot of committees that we work through. And we have committees of executive council, we have committees of general convention, we have committees all over the place. So a lot of what I also do is appointments. So back in the fall, or actually a few weeks right after general convention, the general convention office put out a interest form like that Survey Monkey that I filled out 10 years ago, and asked anyone, whether they were deputy or bishop or anyone, to fill it out to see what they were interested in, because we had all these what are called interim bodies. They're the various task forces and committees between general conventions that pick up the priorities of general convention. And I had over 1,200 applications and 750 spots. So I had to go through everyone's application and put them in a committee if I could. And there are great people that just kind of didn't fit, because then you have to look at each committee and say, do I have good representation from across the church in this committee, good representation of identity? And then it turns out, and President Jennings had reminded me that the appointment process never ends. So I am also doing all kinds of appointments for committees still. And a lot of those appointments are joint appointments. So I'll appoint lay and clergy, and the presiding bishop appoints bishops. And we try to together have conversations about, is the composition of this committee representative of the broader church? So that is quite a lot of work, but that is also why I love doing things like this, because then I get to meet a lot more people across the church, and then I can keep them in mind for appointments down the line.
Yeah. I remember when that form came out, because I've been watching and waiting because I wanted to be on the task force for.
Oh no.
No, I'm on the task force. We have a meeting.
I was like, wait.
Yes. I was one of the lucky 750, but I just remember being like, it was the first time I ever tried to get on an interim body, and I didn't know how the process worked. And then I got the email, and I was like, so like, I'm on this task force, and I'm like really excited, because it means I get to talk, work with people from all over the church.
On something that's really important and passionate to you. And that's where, not to interrupt, but that's where we harness people's passions and excitement about our church, is to be able to get them involved in those ways through stuff like this. I mean, it sounds kind of boring when I talk about governance and committees, but you know what it's like when you're there and you're like, oh my gosh, I get to be a part of, making change in the church. And it's amazing.
So to follow that up, what would your words to a congregation be in terms of paying attention to life in the wider church and opportunities to serve the church at large?
Oh, yeah. When it comes to paying attention, I think, media sources are always helpful. Episcopal News Service is usually on top of things that we're doing, but also being engaged at the diocesan level. And I mean, part of what we know, I love church governance at the church-wide level. And obviously, and I felt really called to it. But I'm also aware that a lot of ministry is local and in your parish. So if that is a place where you feel called, like I was when I was a youth minister, that being able to find fulfillment there and is good for your soul, right? And it's good for the community. But also if you're called to do that at the diocesan level, I just want to say, like, go for it, and ask questions and ask around. I followed Episcopal News Service when I was just church geeking out by myself in my house, watching Catherine Jefferson get elected and that sort of thing. So just kind of keeping up on that. My office puts out a newsletter, the House of Deputies news, once a month. And so we'll be putting out more and more information in the coming general convention. And I think just finding ways to get plugged in. Mostly if people are interested in that general convention level stuff, running for deputy at the diocesan convention would be the thing to do. So our next deputy elections will be in 2025. And for the 2027 general convention, I know it sounds really far off, but I'm actually leaving on Sunday to be a part of the site visits for the 2027 general convention. So to me, it doesn't feel that far away.
Yeah.
Everything feels very close. But just, finding ways to get engaged. I know on social media, there's a whole bunch of groups. So, Facebook has all kinds of groups. Twitter is hilarious in their sarcasm. If you like being sarcastic. And then there's a new under 40 caucus that's just been developed. They just voted on their leadership and they're pretty active on Instagram, so you can find based on not that you have to be pigeonholed by your generation with what social media you use, but it's just kind of a reality, right? So
Thanks for that. I'm gonna open up the floor for questions because I want people to have their time to chat with you. So if you have questions, I think Roger will share them with us. I'll keep asking questions until I get questions from the Q&A, but I don't see anything yet. So remember, folks, you can ask questions via the Q&A chat, and we'd love to have them. So Julia, I'm wondering what you think are the challenges facing the Episcopal Church right now, and then what practices and groups are you seeing around the church that inspire some hopefulness for our future?
Is there a way if I jump with the groups first? Because I just talked about one. For example, the brand new under 40 caucus. Or maybe I should take it so I end on a good, now I'm overthinking it. I'll just start with the groups. So we have a brand new, what's called, General Convention Under 40 Caucus, and caucuses are fully independent entities. We have a Deputies of Color caucus that it consists of 4 different ethnic caucuses, they're called. So the Black Caucus, the Latino Hispanic Caucus, Indigenous Caucus, and the Asian Caucus. And we have a couple other, essentially they're like interest groups that you would see in government. The under 40 folks self-organized, put together an agenda for themselves, and they're indicative of a lot that I am hopeful for in the church. So earlier we talked about Trek and pre-pandemic, right? That we were already looking at declining Christian faith and practices across the country in the United States. And the pandemic has really accelerated all kinds of pace of change, right? We're meeting over Zoom, not in person. Technology has a bigger influence on everything that we do. And what we also know is that younger and younger generations, as they look to institutions like the church, have less and less confidence in faith institutions, and especially the church, because the more scandals that they see, whether it's in government or by church officials, the less likely they are to attend church. And the pandemic has taken a huge hit, as we all know, to church attendance, but in particular for young people. So while that's a challenge, one of the places where I find hope is that we do have a whole lot of young people. The caucus is one example, who, despite these trends across the country that we see, and these generational trends, really love and believe and find belonging in the Episcopal Church. And, I think, I don't know how old you were, Ryan. I'm just barely too old to be in the under 40 caucus. I think they jokingly said that they capped it at 40 because I'm 42.
Oh, no.
The president can't be a part of it. So, because I'm friends with a great number of them. I thought it was.
I want to join this group. Yeah.
But I mean, so the thing that I find hope for is that they're so inspired and they're so committed to us and our church. And I say us, I mean the Episcopal community, right? We're all in this big family together. And they're willing to, be heard and make change and try to show us new ways of being and doing church. And at the same time, like any other institution, we have a hard time listening to those voices. Yet I think that we're at this critical moment in time right now. And a lot of people will point to my election because I'm the youngest president of the House of Deputies. And again, I'm 42. So my age comes up a lot. So I can't hide it or anything. But, like some people don't, I don't have the option to, point that, that the church is ready for a generational change in leadership. And which is funny because I feel really old, like, I'm too old for Discord or whatever.
Yeah.
But my daughter says I am. She's 15 and she says, no, you're not allowed to go on.
I would say I'm 35. I use Discord all the time.
You do? Okay. All right. I'll see if I can convince her. She's the real boss. So. But I think that that perhaps we are at a moment where we're willing to, and again, I think prompted by the pandemic, right? We all had to look to younger and younger people to say, how does this work? How do I unmute myself? How do I get I'm having technological problems, or how are we going to have vestry meetings or annual meetings, right? So I'm so hopeful because of the energy and passion and excitement and commitment that younger people have, and that we're right on the precipice of really being able to listen to those voices.
Yeah, that's my hope, is that too, that younger folks will be able to share their voices and opinions and find that the church wants to hear from them across the board, like in the national church, but also locally as well. Mm-hmm. I have a question for you that has come through, and some people would like to know, what do you do for fun outside of, nerding out with the Episcopal Church and outside of your work on your doctorate?
Some of my hobbies have kind of gone to the side. I will say so it's my husband and my daughter and I, there's three of us, and our rescue lab, who's hilarious, but the most extroverted of the four of us in the family. We really like sci-fi. And so we're really into Star Trek and Star Wars, more on the Star Trek side. So we just finally, and because of our travels, and we only watch them together. So my husband had just come back from Uganda. I just came back from an Episcopal meeting. And so we finished off the final season of Picard. And that brings us so much joy. I can't even tell, it doesn't sound like a hobby, but it's a big event. And my husband and I also do a lot of gardening together. So we've gotten into native wildflowers in Oklahoma. So we actually do now get all kinds of information from the Lady Bird Johnson Center for Wildflowers that's down in Austin. I kind of feel like a big nerd right now, and I had to go to Austin recently. And so I was checking all the wildflowers on the side of the highway. I was just stunned by it and, and just couldn't get over it. So it's a lot of gardening and sci-fi, and I love to cook. So when I can and do have time, I really like to bake. There's something about kneading the bread that really helps, feels like it heals my soul.
Do you ever bake bread for your local congregation, for your parish congregation?
Oh, I did a long time ago. I should do that again. Yeah. I like like making like Dia de los Muertos bread, even if it's not Halloween time. So it's like a eggy orange bread that is just delicious.
It's so good. Yeah. We should come to Austin sometime, come back to Austin sometime and go to the Lady Bird Johnson Center. Then you can see all of the wildflowers. It's very exciting. I was gonna say, as someone who was raised by a serious Trekkie, I think I think Star Trek is definitely a hobby.
Okay.
Yes, definitely counts as a hobby, and it's really cool. So that sounds like really exciting, and the fact that it's something you can do as a family. I think sometimes we think of hobbies as like individual things we do alone or by ourselves, but to have family hobbies is really nice because it means you're like built in time together.
Mhm.
We're gonna start wrapping up, but I think my final question for you is actually a backtracking question that I like while I was writing notes. You said that you did an international ministry in Sudan, and did you say Namibia? Did I make that up? I'm wondering, like, what was that like, and did you do that as like a part of the Episcopal Church, and how long did you do that?
Yeah, it was with the Mennonite Central Committee. So we went with the Mennonite. It was similar to Peace Corps. The Mennonites had a setup similar to Peace Corps. And we were in South Sudan and Kenya. So at the time, South Sudan wasn't a country yet. It was Southern Sudan. And we lived in Kenya because that's where all the NGOs, which are nonprofits, were based. And then they would send people into to Southern Sudan at the time. So we were doing that. And then in this post-war context, a lot of the Western nonprofits, so the Mennonites, the Anglicans, the Church of Sweden, and the Presbyterians in Australia, so it was Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Americas, decided that it was time to move back into Southern Sudan. So at that time, my husband and I decided that we would be the first Westerners that would permanently live in Juba, South Sudan, which is now Juba, or Southern Sudan at the time. Now Juba is the capital of South Sudan. And so we stayed on a compound with the Wycliffe translators, which are like the Bibles that you see in the hotels. And what they were doing they were trying to preserve the languages of the people of South Sudan at the time. And so I essentially was a strategic planner and did a lot of appreciative inquiries and tried to build the capacity of local South Sudanese nonprofits to be able to have financial management capabilities, to be able to write their own grants instead of coming through the nonprofit we worked with. And my husband was he's a city planner, so he did a lot of emergency planning. So he would go off to do mosquito net distribution or look at landmines were a big deal along the border between the North and the South. And so check on how are we doing with disarming landmines. And during that time, we had our daughter. So I had the pretty unique experience of being one of the, foreigners with a baby, when otherwise it was local women with babies. And so that was another ministry opportunity for me because I was able to, build relationships with women in South Sudan just by virtue of showing them that I also had my baby here. And it was just a really interesting kind of special time. But we were there for about 3 years and got to see all kinds of interesting, international aid type of experiences and what works and what doesn't work on the ground and what kind of relationships one can build to have that sort of authentic ministry between the American West Church or the European Western Church and local churches, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa.
That's really cool. It sounds like you have such a rich experience of like strategic planning and figuring out how to get the voice of everyone and then make implementations based on that. And so I am really excited to see how your first term continues to unfold. And I'm really excited for you. And I'm just so grateful that you gave your time this evening to us here at Palmer Church. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I so appreciate this. This has been very life-giving.
Well, I want to jump in and just say again, on behalf of Palmer and the staff and the vestry and clergy, we're so grateful for you, and we're so grateful for the work that you are doing in the church. And I just sat here and loved watching you and Ryan have a conversation. She's remarkable, and the two of you together were super remarkable. So I've been homesick, so y'all forgive me for my crackling voice. But again, I am thrilled that you were with us. I do want to real quick just update folks on what's happening this weekend. We have a busy weekend ahead, and we have on Saturday, as a reminder, Buildings and Grounds Fiesta Dinner, thus the dancing that is taking place above Ryan, and information about that is online. Then on Sunday, we have our Sunday morning formation series called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, exploring resurrection in the season of Easter. And this Sunday, we have Dr. Sin T. Lee, who is going to be doing environmental stewardship as resurrection and talking about that. The following Sunday, I'll be the speaker for the adult class, mental health as resurrection. And so looking forward to that as well. Also, Sunday afternoon, we have Evensong at 4 o'clock. So I encourage you to find a space to get involved this weekend. Take care of each other, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And Julia, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what happens in the church. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great night.